Welcome to your Artsy Girl podcast. I am your host, Christina Carrere. This is a podcast about art, poetry, writing, and anything about creativity. Sit back, relax, and get your dose of brain food to get your creative juices flowing. Welcome to episode 56. Today's featured guest is Susana H. Case. She is the author of 7 books of poetry. Drugstore Blue from Five Oaks Press won an Independent Publisher Book Award. She is also the author of 5 chapbooks, 2 of which won poetry prizes. Her most recent chapbook is Body Falling, Sunday Morning, from Milk and Cake Press. One of her collections, The Scottish Cafe, from Slappering Hall Press, was re-released in a dual-language English-Polish version. Her poems appear widely in magazines and anthologies. Recent poems can be found in Calyx, The Cortland Review, 14 Hills, Portland Review, Potomac Review, Rattle, and Rhino, among others. Dr. Case is a professor and program coordinator at the New York Institute of Technology in New York City. Everyone, please welcome my next featured guest, Susana H. Case. Hi, Susana. How are you?
I'm good, Christina. Thank you so much for having me on the show. It's such an odd time to be talking about a new book. It's just, we're just coming out of lockdown here in New York City. So things are starting to open up, but there are no more, for the moment, there are no more in-person poetry readings. Everything is on Zoom or Facebook Live or Skype. And so here we are.
Yes. Yes, but that's good, though. I mean, we could still stay connected in this way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So before we go into your new book and all, tell us where you're from and where you grew up.
I was born in New York City, and I grew up in New York City, and that's rather unusual in New York City because most of the people I meet are from someplace else, which is what I like about living here. And you can see a lot of that in my poems, the allusions to New York City. I will probably die here too. Every so often you hear people talking about how, well, New York City is dead now. It happened after 9/11. It's happening now, but no, I am staying here.
Okay.
So are a lot of other people. So
you went to school, also high school and everything in New York City.
Yes, I did. Yes.
Great. So your new book, can you tell us a little more about, before we go into your new book, one more thing. How did you get into writing and poetry?
Well, I wrote as a teenager even. My father was an English teacher, so it wasn't such a stretch. It wasn't such a weird idea to want to write. He had written radio plays that were translated into Italian for what was then the larger immigrant population. He wasn't Italian, but nevertheless, he was the son of immigrants, so what he had to write about was resonant. It didn't matter so much which was the new group or which was the group. The experiences were similar. Uh-huh. So he actually bought my first poem. Probably the most money I have ever gotten for a single poem.
Wow.
He gave me $100 for my poem. So I guess the communication there was, this is an okay thing to do. This is a nice thing to do.
So you got great validation early on.
Yes.
About how old were you then?
A teenager, I'd say. Okay. I don't remember exactly. And later I became a university professor, but in sociology. And then after a period, I decided I needed to write something other than academic prose. And so I found new teachers and returned to poetry.
So were you a very observant child?
I'm not sure.
Well, I always thought sociology was like, studying people and studying,
So I was in poetry also. I consider myself observant.
But my father always said I like the dark side of things, the things that are sort of over the line. So I guess that attracts both sociologists and poets, right?
When did you start publishing your poetry then?
I started publishing my poetry in the 90s, but not in a collection or a series of any sort until 2002, when I won the Slappering Hall Press chapbook competition, a great competition, by the way, for any listeners who haven't previously published a chapbook or a full-length book. And that was a very nurturing environment for me, the Hudson Valley Writers Center. So they really taught me how to be a professional poet. I had no idea.
Right. And by the way, I featured Lynn McGee and Margot Taft-Stever, who runs the Slappering Hall Press.
Margot Taft-Stever is the the founder of the Hudson Valley Writers Center and Slappering Hall Press. And Lynn McGee also won the Slappering Hall Press chapbook competition some years before me. And Margot was my first editor on that.
Nice. I like this. I got a whole little group going on.
Yes, you do.
I got the New York crowd.
You do. Lynn McGee is actually a member of our weekly writing group. We meet every week with the two other women, and we share poems and offer. And
you also used to also do readings and stuff together, right?
Yes, we do. And in fact, we're now starting to co-edit a new series with Bill Moore on the West Coast called East West, in which we try to bring together poets from the West Coast and the East Coast. So our first event is this weekend, actually, and we'll see how it goes. We have 3 poets from there and 3 poets from the East Coast.
And you're going to do a Zoom thing?
We're going to do Zoom, of course.
Awesome. And when is that going to be?
That's going to be sent tomorrow, actually, the evening, and we'll see how it goes. But it's an interesting lineup. It should be quite nice. And one of the reasons we are doing it is because we realized on the East Coast, we don't really know the West Coast poets as well as we should, and it's probably the same for them. So this seemed the perfect time to do it.
And that's very interesting, especially during the contemporaries. I know when we study poets, we always say that we find that there's different schools. You have the East Coast poets and the West Coast poets, and this is neat. You're kind of like bridging the gaps there and connecting. Yeah.
That's our aim. That's what we're hoping to do. So we'll see how it goes. Yeah.
So tell us now about your new collection.
Well, the new collection is called Dead Shark on the N Train. Again, a very New York title, because the N Train is one of the subway lines here in the city. It goes to Coney Island. It's published by Broadstone Books, and it came out at the beginning of this month, so it is brand new. And it seems like some people have said they expected it to be a funny book. It's not a funny book at all, actually, but Dead Shark on the N Train is one of the poems in the book. So it's named for one of those poems. I write a lot about gender, and I teach gender also, actually. And in Dead Shark in particular, Dead Shark on the N Train in particular, there's a lot of work about gender. There's a lot of work about violence. And I also use history. All of those interests come together in Dead Shark on the N Train, which also includes some poems about misuse of animals and more as comments on human behavior than as nature poems.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I saw the book cover. You would think that it may be kind of comical, but no, those are kind of heavy topics you touch on.
Yes. The cover is actually the work on the cover, although it's been modified by having the shark coming out of the into the bottom of the page, but the artwork that's used on the cover is a old WPA painting by Lucy Faridi, and so it's a very old painting of the subway. But one of the things I liked about it is that even though it was painted in the 1930s, when New York, in many ways, was a much more segregated city than it is now, you have a very diverse group of people sitting in that subway car.
Sure.
I looked at a couple different artworks of the New York subway system at that time, and this one stood out for me.
Yeah. I could tell it had the 1920s, 30s vibe to it.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Except for the shark that's coming out, and and actually, when I talked about the cover with Larry Moore, who's the publisher for Broadstone Books, I said, "Can you put a shark in there somewhere?" And he said yes, and he actually researched the types of sharks that occur off the coast of New York City. So that is a anatomically correct shark.
Very good.
It's a New York City.
So, speaking of sharks, what does the shark represent then?
In the poem Dead Shark on the N Train, it represents a sort of objectification, in this case of the animal, but also in the poem of a person who appears in the poem. There is a lot about objectification in the manuscript, in the book. Mostly objectification of women, but sometimes objectification of men, and sometimes objectification of animals.
I'd like you to read that poem.
Yes, I'm going. Yeah, should I do that now?
Well, I have a question also. Okay, yeah. So now, why objectification? Why do you focus on that particularly?
Because I think there is a relationship between that and violence. I think that the dehumanization that occurs is connected to a greater willingness to act out against someone as an object, not as a person.
So when someone objectifies, like say a man objectifies a woman, you would say that that's the leering or checking out, or
that it might be that any kind of behavior in which she becomes dehumanized.
Just body parts.
Yeah. I mean, it seems sort of weird to talk about a shark being dehumanized, but it's the same kind of process. And what you'll see in the poem also is that the person who appears in the poem has also been dehumanized.
Okay, well, go ahead and share that with us, please.
Okay, so this is Dead Shark on the N Train, the title poem. Poor brown fish beached at Coney Island, then carried in someone's arms to the roller coaster where another man thought it beautiful and tried to transport it home, only to abandon it on the subway. And you know how it is in New York City. Nothing surprises anyone. The car reeked of dead shark, and passengers took photos, debating Instagram filters when the conductor asked everyone to leave and closed off that train. At the end of the line in Queens, a transit worker plastic bagged the body and normalized the car. I fled Queens when I grew up. Like sharks that migrate freely, I traveled to survive, didn't want to reach the end of my line in the same place I started out from, though I ended up just on the other side of the river. When someone on the number 1 had a heart attack and died, his corpse rode the loop from South Ferry to the Bronx and back to South Ferry twice. Like a man in his habitat, he seemed to be napping. Unlike the shark, no one put a Metro card under his fin, cigarette in his jaws, can of Red Bull by his side for the journey.
Did that really happen?
In a sense, yes. I mean, the poem is an embellishment of an actual incident in which there was a shark on the subway.
Oh.
And there was also probably not just one, but at least one situation in which someone who died on the subway rode back and forth without anyone noticing.
Wow! Wow!
Yes.
Oh my. Well, I heard a lot of intersections in that poem. You know, the speaker and the shark symbolizing, much deeper themes like you mentioned.
Yes.
Very good.
Well, there's some very personal poems. That poem has a lot of personal stuff in it, but there's also poems which are historical. There are poems based on art. That Maria Callas appears in a poem. Mm-hmm. Marilyn Monroe appears in a poem.
Could you share us the Marilyn Monroe one?
Sure. I don't know if it's all that widely known, but Marilyn Monroe wrote poems, although they were not published in her lifetime. And this poem is called The Unpublished Poems of Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn in a striped swimsuit reading Ulysses, photographed by Eve Arnold, 1955. She wanted blondes to be thought sexy and astute. She wanted herself to be thought astute. Blonde, pejorative, 19th century, as in dizzy blonde, as in a blonde moment, as in risque British burlesque performer, as in French courtesan Rosalie Duthay. Marilyn left fragments of handwritten texts, crossed out words, inserted phrases, her memories, dreams, fears, enjammed. The public knew only the lines of her Cupid's bow, but no silly woman would stand by Arthur Miller as he refused to name communists. Marilyn, surrounded by 430 books with penciled notes, writes to herself, "Ah, life, they have cheated you."
Wow. Yeah, I didn't know that about Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah, she did have a lot of books, but of course she was thought of as, kind of the ditzy blonde.
Yeah, that's what they portrayed. But I knew she had some depth in her, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Do you have one more to close out? Okay.
Sure, I do. These are, the middle section of the book is based on the dioramas of a woman named Frances Glessner Lee, who, like many women of her time and class in the earlier part of the 20th century, built doll houses, didn't go to college, didn't have a job. But her doll houses were different in that they all were crime scenes, and they all had dead bodies in them. Very finely constructed artworks. There was a show of them at the Smithsonian a few years ago. So this is a poem based on one of her dioramas, a diorama called Two-Story Porch, in which there is a dead body on the street and the front of a house with someone looking over the railing, and is called Small Caliber.
Okay.
Small Caliber. Where are you going with a .22 in your hand, showing off your Second Amendment, shooting off your mouth, shooting her struck dumb in the chest, struck dumb boy? He struck her shooting upward from the street, anonymous shot, she on a chair, still in her apron and hairnet, hanging the weekly wash on the two-story porch, body falling Sunday morning. Husband, drunk and cantankerous, he could have done it. loose with his hands. He, too, owns a .22 and a swagger.
Wow. Those are pretty deep. I mean, the visualizations there, I mean, you don't even have to see that to imagine the scene.
Yes, it's quite a scene. All of them are quite interesting. 18 of them are owned by Harvard, but they're on display at the medical examiner's office in Maryland. Yeah, and
I'll have to check that out. Oh my gosh!
Quite.
Well, you present such history. These are. Did you go to how did you stumble on these subjects?
I have an interest in history, although I was very bad in it in school, mostly because I couldn't remember all the dates in the wars.
Yeah, it's rote memorization. Yeah.
But other types of history interest me. Labor history interests me. The history of art interests me, and the role of certain female figures in history interests me. And so I became interested in her after the show at the Smithsonian, because that was the first time I learned about her, because of the way in which she was so skilled at using what are thought of as traditionally female crafts, sewing. She knitted on. She used pins, like those 1-inch pins you use for sewing. She knitted objects for these doll houses with these 1-inch pins.
Wow.
So everything was very tiny, miniaturized, and everything was very perfect, and everything in these houses worked. And I was intrigued I began to read about her life too, because I was intrigued. How does someone go about doing that? It's such a departure from the way women of that time were expected to do their crafts, to have all these. And she later actually, although she did not go to university, she did eventually train forensic investigators at Harvard.
Oh my! Because
she learned so much about the subject doing.
Wow.
This. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so cool.
It's a story.
It is a great insight, you discussing your collection and how you constructed. It's more than just writing poems and putting together, right? I mean, there's themes, there's threads, just like writing a fiction, and that's what it sounds like.
Yes, absolutely. It started out in its early stages as a manuscript about crime, but I began to realize that crime was just one of there are also little crimes. They may not be illegal things, but there are ways in which we encroach upon each other that are equally important. And that's what I wanted to get at in this particular book. So there are actual crimes in poems about crimes in the book, but there are also poems about these lesser encroachments in which no one gets murdered, but people get destroyed in various ways.
Yes. I would say it's like killing the soul off almost, Mm-hmm. Well, Susana, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. It's very intriguing, and I suggest everyone to go get it. I'm very astounded every time I talk to a poet about their collection, about how, they get the ideas and how they construct it together. It's a very interesting and intimate process. And thank you again for sharing that with us.
I just want to add, it's a mystery also the way it turns out, because until it was actually in book form, I don't think I realized just how dark it was thematically. I mean, there are a few attempts to break it up, but it's really probably my least
It's almost like, macabre, Pulp Fiction-ish kind of, but with such a depth in, like you said, in a sociological kind of way. And I appreciate that very much. What is it that you have down the pike after this book?
I've been working on what I thought were two parallel streams. I always write books about girlhood, and I was continuing to write books about girlhood. And I was also working on a series of poems about the 60s and the Manson years and those particular crimes. But then I realized they're not actually two separate projects. They're really both about the loss of innocence, and I think they're going to come together in some way. I'm not quite sure how exactly yet, but that's my idea. People can get this at broadstonebooks.com. Yeah. Or if they want a signed copy, they can contact me at my website, which is susanahcase.com. That's with Susanna with one N.
Perfect. I will go ahead and put that on the show notes as well.
Great.
So people can go ahead and check that out.
Thank you.
Well, everyone, that is it for now. Please tune in next week for my next featured guest. In the meantime, have a productive and creative week. Bye, Susanna.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.